Well, what if your employer required you to get the COVID-19 vaccine in order to be in the workplace? It is a discussion sure to be on the horizon, and joining us to talk about the legalities of that request is Terry Bonnet with Nemeth Law. Terry, thank you for joining us this evening.
Glad to be here.
So, to vaccinate or not to vaccinate in the workplace, one of those burning questions sure to come. First off, Terry, is it even legal to require this?
Yes, for a private employer who is operating, it is perfectly legal to set health and safety standards for your employees, and that would include a vaccine requirement.
Yeah, so if this does come to be, outside of healthcare industry and workplaces that currently require flu shots, under what conditions can a worker say no, refuse a shot?
Right. And typically, you're right. We have a history of case precedent regarding flu shots. Um, and in those situations, the employer might be required to give an exception to the rule if an employee had an objection based on a disability related reason they couldn't get the shot, or if they had a religious objection to the shot. The employer would have to consider whether or not an accommodation would be required to exempt them from that requirement. Now, when we're talking about a pandemic situation, we're talking about a little bit different situation. We're talking about where there might be a more immediate threat to the health and safety of others if a person refuses the vaccine. And certainly, if an accommodation would present a health threat to someone else, the employer might be in a position to decline that accommodation request.
Mm. So what about workplaces with a union? Is a shot requirement something we may see be at the bargaining table?
Well, certainly we'd have to look at the individual collective bargaining agreements in these situations. Health and safety standards are something that would typically require negotiation with the union, but a lot of collective bargaining agreements are going to allow the employer to implement health and safety standards um, in a reservation of rights clause or in a management rights clause. So you really have to be careful about what that collective bargaining agreement actually says to determine if the employer has the right to unilaterally implement the mandate or whether they would be required to bargain over it.
So what if you're scared, Terry, and you just say, no, I don't want it?
Well, typically an employer would have to grant an accommodation for a religious reason, a medical reason. And when we look at that history with the flu shot, typically, if there's an ethical or moral objection that doesn't rise to the level of religion or a disability, then certainly the employer is under no obligation to excuse the employee from that requirement.
Hmm.
Certainly, I think there are other considerations that we would have to be very careful to look at in a situation like that. Has the employer done, or the employee in raising the objection, triggered any specific protection under, say, maybe an OSHA mandate, or perhaps they're acting in concert with other employees and there'd be some protection from the National Labor Relations Act. But typically, just saying, yeah, I don't want to, is not going to be a valid reason to be excused from the requirement.
Well, of course, breaking news today on Pfizer that we've been reporting. Of course, I'm sure you've heard it. But also, it's been reported that 2 people had allergic reactions to this vaccine. So what happens if your workplace eventually requires you to be vaccinated and you have an adverse reaction? Do you have legal options at that point?
Well, certainly, I think there's going to be some assumed risk in taking a vaccine. Typically speaking, if the injury would arise out of a workplace accident or a workplace injury, that might be covered by the Workers' Compensation Act. But again, I think in those situations, there are going to be some very fact-specific patterns we're going to have to look at to see if there is employer liability that would arise from a mandate where somebody had an allergic reaction, whether that was foreseeable, whether or not that was, related to some action on the part of the employer. But typically, I think that might be covered under workers' comp.
All right. Terry Bonnet, we appreciate your insight. Thank you for answering some of the major questions for us tonight.
You're welcome.
Alan.